You're on the final call, biggest deal your company has ever had.
Legal's happy, pricing's agreed, everyone is ready to sign.
And then procurement sends a 200-question security questionnaire.
You can't answer half of it. The deal goes quiet. And 6 weeks later, the contract goes to a company half your size who had their ISO 27001 ready on day one.
Too often, compliance is treated like paperwork, a box to tick, a hurdle to clear.
Something you deal with at the end of a deal, when procurement asks for it.
But what if compliance isn't the thing slowing your business down? What if it's the reason you're not growing faster? I'm Rebecca Harper.
And I'm David Holloway.
And this is Fishing for Trouble from ISMS.online. ISMS.online helps businesses build, manage, and evidence their compliance. So when the questionnaire lands, you're already ready. But more than that, it's about building real business resilience. And that's what this whole series is all about.
For a lot of organizations, this is where things start to get real. You've got a great product, a strong team, real momentum.
But then you try to land a bigger customer or you expand into a new market, and suddenly you're asked to prove how you handle data, how secure your systems are, how resilient your business really is.
And if you can't show that, deals stall, opportunities disappear, growth slows down. In this series of Fishing for Trouble, we're unpacking how businesses are turning that around. How they're using compliance not as a checkbox, but as a signal.
A signal to customers, investors, and partners that you're ready to operate at a different level.
Today, we're starting with the shift itself. How compliance stopped being a technical issue and became a commercial one.
And how the smartest organizations are running what we call the resilience loop. Identify your risks, build your controls, evidence your maturity, and use that proof to grow.
It's not a one-off certification. It's a cycle. Frameworks like ISO 27001, 27001, 42001, they're the tools that make the loop work.
And the businesses that run it well don't just survive.
They outcompete. We've seen companies lose major contracts simply because they couldn't answer a security questionnaire.
A typical scenario looks like this. A growing SaaS business, good traction. They make it to final stages with an enterprise buyer, and then they fail the security review because they can't evidence their controls.
No ISO 27001, no formal policies, no audit trail. And often they don't just lose that deal, they're not allowed to reapply for 12 months.
Yeah, all this, a company trying to expand into Europe, and suddenly every customer is asking about GDPR, data residency, breach process, and their answer is basically, we're working on it.
And that's not a reassuring answer when you're asking someone to trust you with their data. And in some cases, it's not just lost revenue, it's reputational damage, it's regulatory fines, or worse.
So I think what you can take away from that is that perhaps there's a bit of a sort of a compliance reality gap.
Absolutely. I think that compliance reality gap is, it's a real thing, and it's big. Right? We've seen from our own research, so this is the State of Information Security Report. A shameless plug. We do this every year, have done for the last 3 years. You can download it from the ISMS.online website, no form fill required. So within that research, we surveyed 3,000 information security professionals in the UK and in the US, right?
Yeah.
And they told us that 80% of them were already aligned with standards like ISO 27001 and SOC 2, those types of frameworks. But 37% of respondents said that they struggle to comply with the regulations that they have. So this is the problem that we see, right?
Yeah, it's just that gap between knowing you have to have it and then actually being compliant with it. And I think it's quite interesting that I think, was it 48% say that compliance still gets treated as an afterthought as well. So it's only at the moment that they need it. Maybe it's a procurement requirement, or they're trying to enter a deal, or they're looking to move into a different market, and suddenly they need it. And so then they'll invest in it. So that gap between it's actually going to help us grow our business and, oh, we need it just to win business is huge. And I think that's the big miss that most businesses make. They do it because they think they have to, not because they think it's actually going to grow their business. But if they do it right, it will grow their business. It will become a commercial driver.
Yeah, exactly. So it comes down to the why. Why are you doing this? If you're only doing it for another reason, it's a means to an end, right? Then that's the trap. It means it gets treated as a one-off thing, an obstacle to get over. We'll just do that. We'll check the box, and then we'll move on to the thing we're trying to do.
And we won't think about it for a year.
We won't think about it again.
So we have to do a survey.
Right. And then we'll have that fear when the auditor comes and knocks on the door in a year's time and says, oh, these things that you were doing a year ago, you're still doing those. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. You have to ask yourself, why are we doing this? Because at the end of the day, let's take ISO 27001. Many people will know, so that's the international framework for for information security. This stuff, there is, for the right reasons, a level of complexity, a level of depth to this. You aren't just going to get your information secure in an afternoon, right? That just can't be done, because doing this right involves organizational change, cultural change. It isn't about ticking a box. It's never been about ticking a box, right? And I think that's one of the shifts within the market that we've seen, right, over the last few years.
Yeah. I think it's a misunderstanding of what compliance was supposed to do. It was never supposed to be about a certificate or a piece of paper. It was supposed to be about encouraging businesses, like you say, to make structural change, to bring their staff and their leadership on this journey of how do we become more information secure businesses? How do we show our customers and our clients that we are someone that can be trusted? They're the reasons this compliance exists, not just for a certificate on the wall at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And we should also say that during that audit process, and you and I have both, been through it a number of times. Yeah, exactly. The auditors will want to speak to members of your staff. They will want to kind of interview them as part of that, part of that audit process. So, it can't live. And this whole kind of compliance piece, if you like, it can't, or certainly shouldn't, live in just on one person's computer, on one person's desk, in one person's to-do tray, if you like. This is a company-wide thing that you have to embrace. And if you do that right, then that's when you can start to kind of reap the commercial benefits, right? And again, some stats that that we've seen. So 42% of companies that are able to demonstrate, good compliance, good governance, if you like, 42% enjoy increased trust, increased retention. 44% have improved decision making. 1 in 3 see an increase in new business. So it's very much moving away from, oh, it's a problem that we have to solve and a cost that we have to bear, and changing that thinking completely to being like, actually, this is a way for us to grow faster.
Yeah. And that's 3,000 professionals that have told us that. So that's not an anomaly. That they are big percentages that we're talking about. So those businesses are already reaping those rewards. So if you're not working this way, you're missing out on all of that potential and all of that opportunity to build your business, make your customers happier, get them to stay with you longer. So there's so much you are missing out on if you're not approaching compliance in the way that we see it functioning well for businesses.
And of course, treating it as this, this point in time exercise, it's never going to work, because the world of regulation and regulatory change, that's moving all the time. And one of the things that's moving it the fastest is the evolution of AI, which is changing daily. So you can't really say, well, we were compliant 6 months ago, 12 months ago, so everything must still be fine today. Obviously, your organization has had a lot of change over that time, and you're likely now going to be exposed to different regulatory pressures, especially if you're trying to get into a new market, or potentially kind of get into a new supply chain. So having the ability to run what we would call a resilience loop, which covers information security, data privacy, and AI governance, interconnecting those things allows you to get a lot of efficiency across the different areas that you have to comply with, build this resilience loop, and then enjoy real operational resilience as a business. Changing it from it's a certificate on the wall or in someone's drawer, or maybe on the floor somewhere kind of thing, to an actual living and breathing resilience loop that helps your business survive and thrive, right?
Yeah, 100%. I also think it positions you in a way that as things do change, you are much more able to quickly respond, quickly update. You're not starting from scratch. You're not investing in another platform. You are operating in this cohesive manner, which means you are, like you say, efficient. But as things change, you're much more agile as a business, which is a key part of resilience at the end of the day. If you're able to move quickly and efficiently, you are going to outcompete people that are not working in this way. So,
And I think, again, some of the companies that were set up to provide tick box compliance services, if you like, that they were really there to help businesses. They're optimized for an audit process,
yeah,
right? Not optimized for, embedding operational resilience. It's a totally different concept.
couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And I think, and we hear from guests in this episode as well, that the concept of being sort of compliant on paper, that's just entirely superficial, right?
Yeah. If your compliance process exists in policies that no one reads and bits of paper in drawers that no one reads, it's not effective, and it's not compliance. It's just not. It fundamentally misunderstands what compliance is there for.
Absolutely. And I think an important point there is, and we still experience this frequently, people sort of thinking, this is cumbersome, it's going to slow us down, right? It's a hassle. But of course, what we see with all the companies that we work with, it's not like that at all. Do it right, bring your people on that journey with you, ensure everyone understands why this is important, put into place the right kind of resilience loop and platform to support that. And actually, you're not going to move slower, you're going to move faster, right?
Yeah. Do it once, do it right. It's way more financially efficient, efficiency for your business operationally. Like, there's just no point in being compliant on paper because it doesn't serve you in any way. So if compliance is no longer just about ticking boxes, the real question becomes, how do businesses actually use it to grow? Because this isn't just a security issue anymore. It's an investment decision, an evaluation question.
When a private equity firm is doing due diligence, they're not just checking your revenue. They're asking, if something goes wrong tomorrow, does this business survive? And if you can't demonstrate that, then the multiple comes down. And sometimes that's the difference between a business that scales and one that stalls.
To unpack that, we're hearing from Daniel Bailey, partner at ECI, and Kieran Martin, former head of the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, who you will also hear more from in later episodes of the podcast.
Between them, they've seen both sides, investment and real-world impact. We started by asking Daniel why compliance matters so much to investors.
ECI is an investor, so we look for three things in all of the businesses we back. So resilience, growth, and ambitious management teams who want to work with us. Resilience can take many forms, but a very important one is cybersecurity and information security compliance. Firstly, it is that resilience piece. So protecting your business, protecting your customers' data, protecting your employees' data. Because if you fail to do that, ultimately, then it can have, at best, financial consequences for you as a corporate, but at worst, it can be cataclysmic. It can literally cause your business to fail and people to lose their jobs and shareholders to lose all their money. So it's really important.
That's not theoretical.
That's companies disappearing because of a breach.
And that's the thing most people miss. Investors don't look at your ISO certificate on the wall. They look at whether you've built resilience into the way you operate as a business.
That's a valuation signal, not a compliance checkbox.
So at its core, compliance is about survival. What actually happens when businesses get compliance wrong in the real world? Kieran Martin.
Sometimes nothing at all, and that's part of the problem. For many years, doing not very much and hoping for the best has turned out okay for some organizations, but that's a matter of luck. So what you then see for other organizations is they bake in practices that when they become aware of threats that they don't have the time or resources, or it's a bit like upgrading the tube network in London. It's very hard to close it down in order to upgrade it. So if you don't take security and assurance seriously early on, you are relying on luck, or you have to repent at leisure, which is costly and time consuming.
But that's only half the story.
The other side of the ledger, if you like, that is maybe less well documented or spoken about is actually the the revenue opportunities that compliance gives companies, and specifically a lot of corporates, so customers of our investments, will and increasingly demand that you are able to demonstrate that you are a resilient participant in their supply chains and will look after their data and their sensitive information in an appropriate way. And so actually having a robust compliance posture and not just ticking the box, but actually culturally inheriting and ingesting compliance as part of your organization can help you sell and can help you grow. And I think that's really important.
So when does compliance stop being theoretical and start becoming commercially important?
It depends on the sort of incident that happens to a company. One of the challenges and problems with cybersecurity is there are, broadly speaking, three types of harm. You can get money taken from you, but thanks to huge improvements in the digital financial system, that's less common than it was. So the other two that continue to plague us are losing confidential data. You don't actually lose the data, but you lose the confidentiality of it, but it doesn't disrupt your business. And then you have, of course, the disruptive attack, where your network stops working and you start to bleed financially and you start to lose the trust of customers, you start to mess up your relations with suppliers and so forth. So one of the challenges is that organizations in that middle bucket that suffer data breaches, although these days there are regulatory obligations and so forth, it doesn't actually cost them that much. It's, if you like, a digital pollutant that they end up contributing to more pollution in our digital atmosphere, and criminals use it for attacks elsewhere and so forth. When companies do nothing about it, they can either be lucky and nothing happens to them, they can be unlucky and have a general harm caused that's more for wider society than for them, or they can be cleaned out completely. But when assurance and compliance becomes real, I think it becomes more baked into an organization.
And this is the flip side.
Compliance isn't just about avoiding disaster. It's about getting into deals you wouldn't even be considered for otherwise.
Look, I'd say there are still companies who are maybe just seeking to get the badge, tick the box, and that will help them. But I don't think that is the right approach, because inherently you're still leaving yourself as vulnerable. The standards are a very helpful framework, very helpful guidance. But really it's what you do with that guidance and frameworks that has value. And if businesses are just seeking to get the badge, but not properly culturally sort of adopt the guidance that the frameworks give, then you may still see some of the revenue opportunities, but that might fall down if a potential customer scratches beneath the surface of your cyber or information security posture. But also you're just fundamentally more vulnerable to an attack if you're not adopting the standards in substance as well as form, I think.
We've both seen this. Companies that get the certification, but when a customer digs deeper, the answers just don't hold up.
Compliant on paper. And that's where deals fall apart late in the process, which is the most expensive time to lose them.
What can go wrong when companies treat compliance as a tick box exercise?
It comes back to, classical principles, the famous American general who's famously said, plans are useless, but planning is essential. That's the sort of point that I think resonates very, very much here in cyber. Yeah, there are a number of signs when an organization is treating security and compliance as a tick box exercise as opposed to something that's beneficial. Here's one. If you ask people, what would you do if such and such happened? And the answer is, we have a plan, rather than what's in the plan, then I think that indicates a tick box exercise. And I think sometimes actually regulators and lawmakers don't help in this respect, because sometimes they say you must do a risk assessment. Well, why? You must do an assessment of your vulnerability of this. Well, why? Because then you do the assessment and you've ticked a box, but whether you've acted on it, etc., is the important thing.
So, even with the right frameworks, if the culture isn't there, the risk still is. So how much of the risk really comes down to people and behavior inside a company?
If, for example, you take that to a very literal extreme and say people are the weakest link, that's a disaster. because then you end up in the awful situation that, for example, the Irish healthcare system ended in 2021, where one person, presumably a stressed, underpaid, overworked healthcare worker with no expertise in cybersecurity, clicks on a phishing link and the entire national health system comes tumbling down. That's unacceptable, and that's not a human behavior problem. That's an organizational issue. That's a technology issue. The technology shouldn't be that weak. The systems that were built, of course, built under human supervision and owned by management, should not have been so porous that one click allows you to take down the entire system. So I don't want people to think that there's a way of training your way out of this problem, because at the other end of the tech stack, it's now well known that one of the biggest problems is we put far too much pressure on individual users and far too little pressure on providers of fundamental tech platforms, the Microsofts and Googles and so forth of this world, who essentially don't have any product liability. You can have a sensible discussion about this as long as you ban the phrase "people are the weakest link." And as long as you ban the phrase "you're only as strong as your weakest link," because if either of those things are true, your organization's stuffed in any and all circumstances. So once you accept that there are things about having a look at the fundamental security of the technology that you're adopting, that's again a human behavior, but it's not clicking on a link. It's a leadership behavior. As long as you take the view that, boards should have skilled and reasonable discussions about cyber, again, that's a leadership behavior and so forth. As long as you've got a positive culture, which is a leadership and organizational issue, which means that if somebody does click on a link and they report it as they should, they're thanked rather than punished and so forth, then there's a huge human dimension to this. As long as people know about flexibility and adaptability and incident response and do sensible things like having hard copy backups of key contact numbers, there's an awful lot, both proactively before anything happens and reactively when something happens, where human behavior is crucial.
Daniel Bailey.
One of the things that the frameworks such as ISO 27001 do is mean that as a business, you already have processes, content, and if implemented properly, a information cybersecurity culture that better allows you to address the concerns of your prospective supply chain. And that can be the difference between you winning a customer or not. So it's really important.
This is where the compliant on paper approach falls apart. When deals stall, when procurement digs in, that's when compliance stops being theoretical and becomes commercial.
I think another company that I sat on the board of for 5-6 years as a UK Microsoft leading cloud partner called Content and Cloud. And that was a generalist managed services provider when we invested, but they actually did a small acquisition that brought in some cybersecurity DNA through a pen testing business called Perspective Risk. But what they then did with that side of DNA is sort of really embedded that culture of security throughout their organization, and not only becoming Cyber Essentials Plus, getting ISO 27001, but also providing pretty sophisticated cybersecurity services to their customers. So managed detection response. They did cyber remediation projects for some very large blue chip names in the UK. I probably won't name them, I'm not sure. But that company really saw an opportunity to improve its own internal operational approach to cyber and information security, but also saw it as an opportunity to grow its own business by using that DNA and using that expertise to serve its customers.
That's the key shift. They didn't just get the badge, they ran the full resilience loop, identified the risks, built the capability, evidenced the maturity, and then turned that maturity into a service they could sell.
Compliance becomes a revenue line, not a cost line. That's the loop working. That's when it stops being defensive and starts becoming strategic.
Cybersecurity should be a board level topic. Information security should be a board level topic. We're also a B Corp as an organization, so we also focus on ESG and carbon reduction and making sure that is a board level topic. So it's really important that this isn't just something that a CISO or an IT director is focused on and the rest of the organization sort of leaves them to it. It's something that a CEO, a chairman should be focused on. And as I mentioned earlier, really a CRO or a CCO as well, because this can help you sell. It can help you grow your business. And ultimately, these standards are a way of conveying trust to investors, but also to prospective customers. And that's really important in the uncertain world that we live in.
This is where it really changes. Because if compliance sits in IT, it stays tactical.
But when it reaches the board, it becomes a growth lever. And if your CEO can't explain your compliance posture in 2 sentences, it's not a strategy yet. It's still a filing cabinet.
It takes time and expertise to adopt these standards. And as mentioned, that's particularly the case if you're doing it properly and embedding it in your organization processes and culture. However, what people perhaps, and some businesses perhaps don't appreciate, is actually there are organizations like IO that can help you adopt these standards a lot faster and pass an audit a lot faster than the conventional models. It's often cheaper and quicker than people expect actually to get to a really good level of adoption of the standards relative to the sort of conventional consulting approach.
There are common technical blind spots. For example, one that we've learned about recently for perhaps bigger and more complicated organizations that have operational technology. It's not just the air gap myth that we've got it air gapped and it can't be jumped. Well, often it can, but even then, I think what the Colonial Pipeline case showed us is the dependence of operational technology on enterprise technology just to do billing and safety and all of that means that if you lose your enterprise technology, you're going to find it very hard, if not impossible, to run your operating technology. So that's one blind spot. There's another blind spot, I think, around in incidents about assuming the best. And we've seen that time and again where organizations have been breached and say, well, it's all very minor. And then over the course of time, some catastrophe comes out. And there can be a blind spot that, just buying a firewall or whatever offers you, protection that, to be fair to the vendors, it doesn't claim to do. But I think what this all speaks to is the fundamental blind spot. And I know it's easy to pick on these people, but in this case, it's kind of true, is often at leadership level. It is a cultural, and to go back to the previous discussion, it is a human question. People at the top of organizations, both executive and non-executive levels of boards are highly capable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. But many of them have no background in this subject, and that's fine. They've no background in lots of subjects, but they seem to be uniquely terrified of this one. So they don't ask the rigorous interrogating questions that they might ask of the actuary when they're discussing the company's pensions liabilities. They're not actuaries themselves, but they feel confident enough to say, well, it doesn't make sense to me. Could you explain that a bit more? Still, and it's 2026, I'm surprised, when it comes to cyber, it's like, no, tell me, what does this firewall do? And what would a different firewall do? And what assurance can we get from this? And when I click on this dodgy link, what actually happens? How do you contain it? What is our resilience plan, etc.? They seem scared by this and they're worried about looking stupid, so they don't ask the penetrating questions.
So, what stands out?
I think first, this is about business resilience, not just compliance. If you get it wrong, the consequences aren't just fines, they can be quite existential.
Second, resilience is a growth driver. It helps you win customers, shorten sales cycles, and scale faster. Daniel's content and cloud example proves that.
I think third, it has to go beyond the badge. Compliant on paper is the most dangerous place to be. The real value comes from embedding it into how you operate as a business.
And finally, this is a leadership issue. If resilience isn't owned at board level, it stays tactical, and tactical doesn't scale.
Over this series, we're going to walk through every dimension of business resilience, from AI governance to supply chain security, the human factor, and proving your maturity to the people who matter most.
Each one is a part of the resilience loop, and by the end, you'll have a clearer picture of where your organization sits and what to do about it.
Because the businesses that build resilience early don't just avoid disaster.
They move faster, win bigger, and scale with confidence.
That's not a compliance story, that's a growth story. Next time, we're looking at AI governance and why it's the part of the resilience loop that most businesses haven't even started yet.
And if you want help building resilience into your business, visit ISMS.online. Links are in the show notes. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if this episode felt familiar, share it with your team.
Thank you for listening.